AP Government Unit 1 Review. This unit introduced some of the foundational ideas of U.S. government and the origins of debates about government that remain with us today. For example, what is the best way to preserve individual rights and liberties while maintaining order in society? Should everyone participate in government or just the highly educated or wealthy? How much power should government have? How can we keep government power from getting out of hand? Which level of government should have the most power, states or federal government? These questions and the shifting answers over time form the basis of political debate in American government. Now I'm going to go over key terms for this unit. Checks and balances, aspect of the Constitution that requires each branch of federal government to gain the consent of the other two in order to act. It's a way where one branch can stop the other branch from being too powerful. Each branch has checks on the other branch to keep them from being too powerful or being tyrannical. For example, the executive branch can check the legislative branch by vetoing a bill. They can check the judicial branch by nominating judges and not enforcing a judicial decision. The legislative branch can check the executive branch by overriding a veto, by confirming judges or ambassadors or department heads. They can check the judicial branch by changing the number of justices, changing the jurisdiction of the branches. They can create other courts. They can also propose a constitutional amendment based on one of their cases. The judicial branch can check both the legislative and the executive by declaring a law or a executive order unconstitutional. Commerce Clause is one of the most important clauses in the Constitution. It's part of Article 1 of the Constitution that gives Congress the power to regulate interstate commerce, which is buying and selling of goods across state lines. And they can, with the implied powers, the Commerce Clause has expanded the federal government's powers over the state government and expanded powers of the national government just in general. The Electoral College. It's a body of representatives from every state in the U.S. who formally cast votes to elect the president and vice president. It is basically a compromise between different factions in the Constitutional Convention. It is another way of representative government or Republican form of government where the Founding Fathers didn't want people to elect the president. So this was a compromise. It is also a case where the winner of the popular vote might not become president because of the Electoral College. Enumerated powers are those powers in the federal government that are explicitly named in the Constitution. You can see them written. They're typically numbered in the Article 1 and in Article 2. They're actually specifically written there. The judicial branch does not have any enumerated powers. Faction is an interest group seeking to influence government for the benefits of its members. Factions could also be considered as political parties or interest groups like the NRA. Federalism is a political system that organizes government into two or more levels with independent powers. It's the system where there's a division of power between national, state, and local, and each level has their own powers, their own areas of influence where they have their own powers. Implied powers, powers of the federal government that are not explicitly named in the Constitution, but are implied by the necessary and proper clause. Limited government is a political system in which the government's power is restricted by laws or by a written constitution, so the government would not have too much power or wouldn't be tyrannical. Natural rights are the right to life, liberty, and property, which no government can take away. They are listed in the Declaration of Independence, and they're also listed in our Bill of Rights. Necessary and proper clause is part of the Article 1 of the Constitution that gives Congress the power to create laws that they find necessary and proper for carrying out its constitutional responsibilities. So typically Congress has used the Commerce Clause and the power of tax to expand the powers of Congress using the necessary and proper clause. They created the first national bank and the second national bank of the United States, even though the expressed powers did not say create a bank. They said they had the power to tax, they had the power to coin money, the power to borrow money, and those were banking functions, and the implied powers of the necessary and proper clause has been used to create a national bank or create civil rights laws or create Social Security. Separation of powers is the aspect of the Constitution that ascribes different elements of power to different branches of government which act independently. So each branch, the legislative, the executive, the judicial, have their own spheres of influence, their own powers. So the legislative branch basically makes laws, and they make laws based on taxing, borrowing, commerce, the Washington, D.C., the military. The executive branch enforces laws. The president has the power to do a State of the Union, to appoint ambassadors, department heads, to get advice from the departments, to make treaties. The judicial branch has judicial review where they can strike down laws that are unconstitutional. So each branch has their own sphere of influence. Social contract is an agreement between people and government in which citizens consent to be governed so long as the government protects their natural rights. So typically people will give up few freedoms, few liberties for protection. And that's one of the reasons why we join the social contract, is for protection. Key documents and cases from this unit: Articles of Confederation, the first government system of the U.S., which lasted from 1776 during the Revolutionary War until 1789. The Articles placed most power in the hands of the state governments. Articles of Confederation was the first constitution of the United States. It was a league of friendship between the 13 colonies or 13 states. Each state had the power to tax, the power to raise an army, the power to make treaties. Each state was an independent country, and the United States was at this point a league of friendship, and the national government had very few powers. They did have the power to make treaties, they had the power to have ambassadors, but they couldn't tax, they couldn't enforce laws. It was a very weak form of government where the states had more power than the national government. The Bill of Rights, the first 10 amendments to the U.S. Constitution, which explicitly protected individual liberties such as freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom of press, right to bear arms, and then you had the no cruel and unusual punishment, the Fifth Amendment rights of grand jury, the right not, there's no double jeopardy. So there's a lot of rights in the first 10 amendments. It was put in by the Anti-Federalists to protect people's freedoms. It was a compromise between the Federalists and Anti-Federalists to get the Constitution approved. Brutus number 1 is a foundational document. It's an anti-federalist essay which argued against a strong central government based on the belief that it would not be able to meet the needs of all U.S. citizens. It argued against ratifying the United States Constitution. It argued that there's never been a successful large republic. All successful republics are small, and as soon as they gain power and gain territory and gain land, they actually become tyrannical. It used Rome, Greece, and other empires that started out as successful republics, but as they grew, they got bigger and bigger and more tyrannical, and argued that the representatives should know the people should know the representatives, and only in a small republic would this be possible, and only in a small republic could people still be free and have their independent liberties, and the government would be responsive to them. Constitution, the foundational laws and principles that govern the United States from 1787. It's our current form of government. It's actually a written form of government. It's got 7 articles. It has a preamble and has 27 amendments. The articles go over the legislative branch, Article 1, the executive branch, Article 2, the judicial branch is in Article 3. Article 4 goes over the relationship between states with privileges and immunities, with how to become a state. Article 5 is how to amend the Constitution. There's 5 ways to amend the Constitution. 6 is the Supremacy Clause and paying debts and no nobility, no religious tests. And then Article 7 is the how to ratify the Constitution. Ratification, 9 out of 13 states had to approve the Constitution. And then there are 27 amendments that were passed after this, starting with the Bill of Rights and the first 10 amendments all the way up to the last amendment was actually proposed by James Madison in 1791, I think it was, and it was Congress could not give itself a raise in the same term. It had to be in the next term after that, and that was approved in 1992. So there are 27 amendments, and then the preamble basically gives the goals of the Constitution, and it's the beginning of the Constitution. Federalist 10 is one of the Federalist Papers. It's one of the foundational documents you need to know. It's an essay written by James Madison, which argued that a strong representative government would be able to control the effects of factions, political parties, and interest groups. It said there's only two ways to handle factions. One is to outlaw them or remove them, which was impossible, and then you have to be able to control the effect of factions. That a large republic, strong representative government could actually control the effects of factions. Federalist 51, it's an essay written by James Madison that explained how the structure of the new government and the Constitution would be necessary, would provide checks and balances to keep the government from being too powerful. It advocated for separation of powers and checks and balances. And the very famous quote is, if men were angels, there would no form of government would be necessary, but because men are not angels, we need the Republican form of government with checks and balances to actually make sure that they didn't get tyrannical. Supreme Court cases, McCulloch versus Maryland, 1819. Supreme Court case that guaranteed supremacy of federal laws over state laws. This is where Maryland taxed the first United States Bank of the U.S. in Baltimore. And this was basically they're trying to tax the federal government, also trying to see whether the state laws were supreme over federal laws. So it had a lot of different effects. The supremacy of federal laws over state laws was affirmed. The implied powers for the Congress making the law creating the national bank was affirmed. So this was a very important case. U.S. versus Lopez, 1995, a Supreme Court case that stopped Congress from using the Commerce Clause to ban guns in schools. This was Congress made a law to have a gun-free zone around schools, and they used the Commerce Clause to do this, but the gun-free zone around schools had nothing to do with commerce. There was no trade. There was nothing at all, and the Supreme Court found that the Congress overstepped its bounds and found that this law was unconstitutional. So the first one, McCulloch versus Maryland, basically validated the Commerce Clause and using implied powers. The U.S. versus Lopez says Congress did not use the Commerce Clause correctly. Key takeaways from this unit: the birth of the Constitution, the first government system of the U.S. The Articles of Confederation had a weak national government due to concerns about centralized power stemming from the American colonies' experiences with the British monarchy. The U.S. Constitution sought to remedy the weaknesses of the Articles without giving the central government so much power that it would become tyrannical. So the Articles could not tax, the Constitution could tax. The Articles of Confederation could not raise an army. The Constitution allowed for raising an army. So all of the weaknesses of the Constitution were fixed with the weaknesses of the Articles were fixed with the Constitution. Passing the Constitution, however, required many compromises, such as the inclusion of the Electoral College, the bicameral legislation with the House and the Senate, also the elimination of the slave trade in 1808. There were just quite a few compromises in the birth of the Constitution. These compromises have had a far-reaching consequence that still affect government in the U.S. today, and we're still arguing about many of the Federalist national government versus state government arguments today. Balancing state and federal power. The proper balance between the federal government and state government has been a source of ongoing negotiation since the beginning. In some instances, federal power has been enhanced at the expense of state power, such as the ruling in McCulloch versus Maryland, Civil Rights Act of 1964, Social Security Act, are federal laws that are supreme over state laws, but federal power is limited. Supreme Court has also ruled that the government has overstepped its authority, such as in U.S. versus Lopez, U.S. versus Morrison that we went over in class. Balancing liberty and order. From the beginning, the U.S. government has attempted to balance individual rights and liberties with the government power necessary to, as the Constitution puts it, to establish justice, to ensure domestic tranquility, and provide for the common defense. The Framers passed the Bill of Rights after the ratification of the Constitution as a safeguard for individual liberties. So we look with the Second Amendment, the right to bear arms versus the right to be safe and not to be killed. We look at the right to be secure in our home, plus the right to actually get the criminals. We're looking today the right to be healthy, to be safe from a disease versus the right to go out and to move and to have basically commerce. So we're balancing liberty and order. Complex policy-making process. The structure of the U.S. government established a constitution purposefully makes policy-making complicated, requiring various branches and institutions and individuals to work together to accomplish goals. So to pass a bill, you have to go through the House, you have to go through the Senate. Each has a complicated process. Then it has to go to the president. The president either has to sign it or not sign it after days. If he doesn't sign it or if he vetoes it, then it goes back to Congress. And then it seems like each bill or law that's been passed, the Supreme Court has to validate it and say that is constitutional because somebody will sue it, whether at the state or the local level. So it deliberately places parts of the government at odds with one another so that they rein in each other. These measures help to ensure that people's will is represented by permitting many people to influence the policymaking process, as well as preserving freedom by limiting the power of the government. So this is a basic review of Unit 1, the terms, the vocabulary, the important cases, and the important documents. And we'll be going over this in our office hours, and we'll be going over this in our review sessions.